Massimo Pigliucci, it's great to see you.
Nice seeing you, Dan. How are you holding up?
Well, I'm doing okay. I mean, we in Missouri are not ground zero the way you are in New York, although your background is allowing me to blissfully forget that you're in the hot zone.
That's right. Right now I'm on top of the Acropolis in Athens.
My parents, though, live on Long Island in Nassau County, which is almost as badly hit as New York City. And as you know, my father is 92, has congestive heart failure. I'm assuming he is in the highest risk category of somebody who, if they get this, they're in trouble. So I'm obviously concerned. You have family in Italy. So you've actually been worrying for a lot longer than the rest of us because it hit there.
Yeah.
Massimo, have you started? Has City College and the graduate centers, have they all gone to online? Are you teaching online now?
Yes, we've been doing that for the last couple of weeks, and actually, surprisingly, considering that CUNY is a behemoth of an organization, it has gone fairly smoothly. I mean, the school decided immediately on a instructional recess, basically giving a week to faculty to catch up with online technology and providing courses to get us started. I had already mine set up, so it was easier transition for me. But they've done that, and then we taught online for a week, and then some colleges realized that actually the students might not be necessarily equipped in terms, especially of hardware. So we're now into our instructional recess for another few days to allow colleges to provide students with tablets and laptops and things like that, those who need it. And then we're going to resume teaching Thursday.
So when you say you're gone online, how online have you gone? In other words, are you doing live with classes, or are you just recording things and using message boards? And
yeah, so those are the two methods, right? We actually have been sort of encouraged by the administration to go asynchronous. In other words, to put pre-recorded lectures and things like that, so the students can have access to them.
So it's not to crash the system. Is the worry?
No, it's mostly. We use Blackboard Collaborate Ultra, which is actually a pretty good tool, and some of us could use Zoom. Actually, CUNY has gotten a professional license the City College has gotten a professional license for all the faculty. No, the systems are doing fine. The concern is, the students are at home and they may not actually be able to connect at the right time because now the whole thing works differently. My class, I'm teaching 2 classes this semester. I just asked my students, I said, I think it would be better to do synchronous because obviously you have a discussion, you have the ability to, they look at me and video in live time, and they can ask questions through their microphone or their discussion board. So, and they all said, yeah, we're fine. So I'm teaching actually synchronously every Tuesdays and Thursdays afternoon. I'm teaching the 2 classes, and the attendance is actually the same.
Yeah, I was going to say you could, if you have it at the time that the class hour was, then they would have. That's the time. That they have that time free because that's the time that they were coming to class. No.
Yes, that's my thinking too. I mean, the administration's point is that, but the situation is now different.
The circumstances might have led to their. Yeah.
So that's why I asked. But since all my students were fine, in fact, they preferred the synchronous teaching, then that's what we're doing.
Yeah.
It's working okay.
I've had a sort of debate with myself, and there's also been a debate in our university amongst the faculty about how good of a job we should be doing. As silly as that sounds, whether we should try to make this as high quality an experience as possible, or whether we should just sort of limp to the end of the semester, which is only a month away. The worry being that if this goes too well, it's going to facilitate an already rush towards online instruction, and provide a very powerful argument for administrations to cut more into faculty lines and stuff. And we have entire departments that are all online now.
Yeah.
And I wouldn't be surprised if they would like to make the whole university that way.
No, that wouldn't surprise me either.
Do you have any feelings about that? Yeah. We're sort of cooperating with, it has to be done, but does it need to be done so well? In other words,
Right. Well, so we haven't had actually that particular discussion inside our department, but my feeling on that at least not yet. My feeling on that is, I'm trying to do my best given the tools that are available, but no, I'm not going to make the extra step of making really professional looking videos and things like that. I don't think that's my job, frankly.
Yeah.
For one thing, and it takes too much time to do it. I think my argument, should the administration push that way when things get back to normal, my argument is actually going to be that I've asked the students themselves, and the students themselves say, no, in class, it's a whole different experience, because sure, we can have a video, we have conversations and all that sort of stuff, but it's not the same. You can't gauge the people in the same way. There's no immediate, the interaction is delayed, and it's like, even in synchronous teaching, you don't get the feeling of that you have in the classroom. And I know that this all sounds very fuzzy and and warm in some sense, but it makes a difference. It does make a difference. You can gauge. First of all, I cannot actually look at the students, right? So I can't gauge their responses, because typically they tend to turn off their video to save bandwidth.
Sure. And
so I can't actually look at the students. They can look at me, but I can't look at the students. So that right there makes a difference. And even when you look at video, if I have 30 tiny little videos in front of me, pictures of people, that's just not the same. So the students themselves are recognizing that, and I'm encouraging that to write that into the teaching evaluations at the end of the semester.
Yeah, I've noticed this, that with the younger faculty, we've done hires pretty steadily over the last few years, and then more and more of them are using PowerPoints and other sorts of things that are pre-made in a sense. Whereas maybe this is just an age thing, but I almost entirely am improvisational. I don't walk in unprepared, but I don't walk in with a script. And very much how the whole thing goes depends on the reactions to the room.
Yes,
so
exactly.
I'm seeing, you know what I mean? In fact,
I
don't know how it's going to turn out by the end until I see the reactions to what I'm saying,
Of course. In fact, I actually went the other way around. Until recently, I was preparing PowerPoint presentation, Keynote. I use Apple software, but still, presentations, very structured and all that sort of stuff. And then I became more and more concerned about the fact that this was a little too canned and a little, discouraging. Sort of live conversation. So now I actually walk into the classroom. I don't use slides at all. And I walk into the classroom just with my notes as reference to what I want to say. And sure enough, what happens as a result is that there's a lot more conversation. The drawback of that, as far as the administration is concerned, is that I literally cannot write a detailed syllabus, because I don't know when we're going to cover a particular topic, because it depends on how much time we're going to get, we're going to use to actually get there. So I just tell the students, look, during the semester, this is what I intend to cover, but I'll let you know week by week where we are and how to prepare for the next round. And that's been far more enjoyable for both myself and the students. Sometimes we spend an entire, I say a few things, and then we spend an entire class just discussing, the consequences or thoughts about that particular thing, and we never get to the end of the chapter. So what? It's okay with me.
Yeah. So what brings us here today is the subject of consciousness, and two what have lately become sort of prominent positions on it. One of which on one side is Panpsychism, and the other on the other side is what we'll just call Illusionism, which is sort of the view associated with Daniel Dennett. What occasions this is that I follow you on Twitter, and you got into a lengthy back and forth exchange with one of the more prominent panpsychists, Philip Goff. You use what is that platform you use to do the letters back and forth?
It's called letter.wiki.
Letter.wiki. Okay, so that which is, by the way, something that I really like the format, and it's something I'm hoping to use myself. You engage in a back and forth with Philip Goff. What did you do? Like 3 or 4 rounds?
3 rounds each, about 1,000 words per round. So it's a nice format, because, as you say, it allows an actual conversation. It's delayed, so you don't respond immediately. It's over a matter of weeks, actually, in our case.
And others can read it. Others can read it then, and it looks like it's nice. So you got into a pretty substantial exchange with him, and then Keith Frankish, who's one of the prominent illusionists had a piece in IAI trying to sort of make the case for illusionism, maybe in a way aside from the way that Dennett has done it, although he does wind up employing many of Dennett's tropes. Now, I know that you're not a fan either of panpsychism or of illusionism.
Right.
And so I thought maybe we would talk, and I'm not inclined to be one either. I'm not sure how far we are apart on consciousness. I have some thoughts about what I think where I think the problem actually lies and why I think it feels like everybody's just banging their heads on something. But I'd like to first with you, what is the problem of consciousness that all of these people are trying to solve? So how do you even understand the issue?
Yeah, that is a good question. So I think that the problem that they're trying to solve is what David Chalmers famously articulated as the hard problem of consciousness. Sometimes it's also phrased as the problem of qualia. Mm-hmm. So the problem of first-person experiences, first-person sensation kind of thing. So here's the problem according to Chalmers. He argues, and he's not the only one, but he's the most prominent of that group. He's basically arguing that, look, even if, and it is a big if, science, neurobiology, cognitive science, whatever science you want, is going to eventually give us a complete third-person description of how consciousness arises inside, in a biological organism using the wetware of the brain and all that sort of stuff. That still doesn't make the bridge, that doesn't bridge the gap between a third-person description and a first-person experience. In other words, there will be, even if you personally, Dan, read everything and understand everything that neuroscience eventually will be able to tell about consciousness, the moment you have an actual conscious experience, seeing a colorful rainbow or something like that, you will gain knowledge that is actually not anywhere to be found in the scientific description. And therefore,
the yellowness of the yellow.
Yeah, the yellowness of the yellow, for instance. Yeah. Right. And so the argument suggests that there is a kind of an irreducibility of first-person experience to third-person descriptions. That's pretty much my understanding of what the argument is. And the major two ways to go about it at this point seem to be, well, actually, I suppose there are three major ways to go about it. One is the one that Chalmers himself goes, and that's dualism. Not substance dualism a la Descartes, but sort of property dualism of some sort, although he leaves it pretty vague. And that's why, he suggested the famous philosophical zombies argument, the notion that it is conceivable that, that you, for instance, could have all the behavior, the outside behavior, external behaviors and manifestations of a human being, but in fact, there is nothing going on inside, that you are identical to a living organism, the same exact structure of the brain, etc., but there is actually no first-person experience going inside. You're just showing the outside signs. You would be a philosophical zombie at that point. That's one answer, such as it is. The second one that's gaining popularity recently is this Panpsychism thing, which has a number of different variations, versions of it, but essentially is the notion that consciousness is actually, in some sense, an elemental property of nature. And therefore, the notion is you solve the hard problem because there is no hard problem. If consciousness is everywhere, it's, including fundamental particles, then there is no problem about how consciousness arises in things that have brains and stuff like that. And then the third solution is the classic Dennett, the Nettian one, which is, well, there is no consciousness. Consciousness is an illusion in a sense. And therefore the problem is dissolved in the other way. So that's my understanding of the general intellectual landscape.
So would you say that it's, that this, I'm going to call it strange, this strange collection of positions is the result of widespread belief in the failure past and the unlikely to succeed future of the reductionist program?
That's right. So, yes, in fact, during my conversation with Goff, it turns out that what he really objects to is reductionism. In fact, even broader, actually, I think he objects to physicalism. He says, right, so it's a metaphysical discussion at that level. It's because I kept asking, I mean, maybe we'll get to this in a minute, but I kept asking him, so what kind of empirical evidence does it bear on panpsychism, or what kind of experiments or observations can you imagine would actually lend support to the panpsychist position? And he very frankly said, none. There isn't going to be none, because I'm assuming a framework outside of physicalism, and therefore there is not going to be any empirical evidence. And that for me was a conversation stopper. It's like, okay, well then you can make up whatever you want, and you tell me, there's never going to be any evidence in favor of this thing. Therefore, fine. You're just making up a story as you go.
Yeah, I mean, here's the reason I'm asking, and that's because the reason I'm asking is, if you took philosophy, if you studied philosophy of mind in the 70s and 80s, and even into the 90s, which is what I did, so I was in college in the 80s, took my first philosophy of mind class probably in 1987, and then I was in graduate school in the 90s. You would have learned primarily about materialist reductionism, right? The various challenges to it from the standpoint of not just consciousness and qualia, but also intentionality. Okay,
right. Sure.
You would learn the various merits of the various variations on physicalism, like functionalism, which seem to satisfy some of these problems and not others,
right.
And so on and so forth. And you would have learned probably that these remain outstanding problems. But it wasn't the case then yet. I mean, there were some exceptions, but it wasn't yet the case then that people went for these very exotic, almost desperate. Is it your perception that something has changed since the 90s that has caused people to become so much more desperate or impatient or whatever, that suddenly now they're going to what I would take to be very extreme, wildly counterintuitive, the sorts of views that would be non-starters in a non-desperate situation?
Right. Yeah, that's an interesting observation. If I had to guess, I would say that there is an increasing frustration with the fact that actually science, contra protestations by Goff and Chalmers and so on and so forth, science is actually making progress in that area. These people often say, science will never solve the problem of consciousness. Well, we don't know anything about consciousness from a scientific perspective. That's simply not true. In order to claim that, you have to ignore a mounting evidence in cognitive science and neuroscience. We actually begin to know quite a bit about consciousness and about, how it is, in fact, a systemic property of the brain, but also there are certain parts that are primarily involved into it. We can alter conscious states of people experimentally. We can do all sorts of interesting stuff that tell you every single one of them, of course, confirms the notion that consciousness is the result of a physical activity in the
you
brain.
Can alter someone's conscience by hitting them over the head. I mean,
Yes, no kidding. Right. But we can now do it in a far more, detailed fashion. You can actually implant electrodes, or in fact, even we can create highly localized magnetic fields inside specific areas of the brain and reproduce the kind of qualia or the kind of sort of qualitative experience that these people are so worried with. Now, does that mean that we have a complete understanding of consciousness from a scientific perspective? Hell no, not even close. That truly is a hard problem.
Yeah.
It's a hard scientific problem. And I'm not even necessarily optimistic that we will ever get to a complete understanding or scientific description of consciousness, not because of any mystical reason or any, metaphysical reason, but just because it's a really, really difficult problem, just like other problems that science has made very little advances over. Let's say the question of the origin of life, for instance. We have plenty of theories, but we don't know. We simply don't know because we don't have enough information about the original situation. We don't have fossil records, so on and so forth. So I'm not one of those who suggest that, given enough time and money and science will solve everything. That seems, naively optimistic. But I don't see any reason in principle why we cannot arrive and a complete understanding of consciousness. So I think, to go back to your question, yes, I suspect that there may be some degree of discomfort or even fear that philosophy of mind is going to be sort of edged out by the science in the way in which, psychology as a science has edged out, psychology as a branch of natural philosophy, the way in which that happened with biology, physics, and so on and so forth. And I actually count that as progress in philosophy. Right? Once that a field becomes mature enough that the answer becomes more heavily empirical, and therefore the field spins off from philosophy and it becomes a science, I think that's welcome news. And now what you have, of course, is the ability to do a philosophy of, in the way in which we do a philosophy of science or a philosophy of biology, or et cetera, et cetera.
Yeah.
So
that's really interesting, and actually, I wasn't expecting to go in this direction, but I will say this one thing about it, which is a sort of disanalogy, and that is, philosophy of mind is unique in the other philosophies in that it's the only one that still purports to be first order, right?
Exactly.
Philosophers of biology don't do biology, right?
Correct.
Philosophers of physics don't do physics, but philosophers of mind are still doing psychology, right? And there's no counterpart in philosophy of biology to something like panpsychism, right?
No, that's right. And I think that's the problem, that we are now, that the philosophy of mind, I think, should evolve into, eventually, at some point, into philosophy of cognitive science, or philosophy of whatever discipline is going to be dealing, empirical discipline is going to be dealing with this kind of thing. I'm glad you mentioned first philosophy, because that was one of my objections to Philip, who interestingly asked me, what do you mean by first philosophy? I thought this was a fairly standard terminology. I mean, Descartes wrote a meditation on first philosophy. So
Aristotle thinks about metaphysics as being first philosophy, right? I mean,
but anyway, so I thought that was kind of standard terminology.
Quine says there's no first philosophy. I mean,
right. So it's I mean, we're talking about fairly big guys here. But anyway, so I said, what you're trying to do here is first philosophy. And I said, I thought first philosophy was essentially dead with Descartes. Descartes was the last great. And I think that, Descartes gets a lot of, crap from people for all sorts of reasons. I think undeservedly. He was a great philosopher.
I agree.
His failure shows, however, that approach had reached an end. That approach was started with the pre-Socratics. Right? I mean, when Thales of Miletus was saying, "Oh, everything is made of water," he was doing first philosophy. Didn't call it that, but he was doing first philosophy.
Look, without Descartes, you couldn't have had Hume, right? I mean, you had to. He showed you the limit of it.
Exactly.
But was still committed because he's from an earlier generation. Then Hume was able to go that extra. Say, no, you did something very important for us, but it's not what you thought, right? I mean, what you showed was
correct. And so I would think that first philosophy would have ended at that point. Imagine Quine had to remind us in the 1950s and 60s that we shouldn't be doing first philosophy, and apparently some people are still doing it, even more than half a century after Quine.
Yeah. So so let's get into the details of this a little bit. First of all, with regard to the panpsychism side of this, one of my problems with it is, aside from the fact that it's first philosophy, aside from the fact that it's just flat out a priori metaphysics, because these people accept the idea that this is not an empirical thesis, despite the fact that it would seem to me that a statement like muons are conscious has to be an empirical statement. I don't see how that can be an a priori statement in the modern framework, right? I mean, I could see how someone like Aristotle could say something like that and have it mean something that's synthetic a priori, but I don't see how in the 20th century, the 21st century, that can be taken as, it's not possible. And so, but my problem with it initially is I don't even see how it's a solution to the problem. So if the problem is supposed to be that there's an aspect of reality that's revealed in first-person experience that's not revealed in third-person experience.
Right.
I don't see how saying that a muon has a little bit of consciousness in it I mean, it almost makes it like consciousness is like jam, and there's like little parts of it, but if you put it all together, then you get a conscious person or a conscious raccoon. I don't even understand how it's supposed to solve the problem.
No, that's right. I mean, that is one of the most puzzling things about this thing. I actually asked Philip specifically. I said, well, so you're not saying that electrons or muons think? And he said, no, I'm not saying that. Okay, fine. I'm saying that they have some elemental version of consciousness. I say, okay, I don't know what that means, but even if I'm going to grant you that statement, you still have the problem of explaining to me why is it that rocks who are made, mountains who are made of many more muons and electrons and stuff like that than I am, they don't seem to think or have first-person experiences, and I do. So you still have the same problem. You can't even say, once enough matter gets together, it starts thinking, because as I said, otherwise you have to say that mountains and planets are thinking, and you don't have an explanation at all. So if you're saying, well, that is because not only of the amount of matter, but the way in which it is put together and interacts with itself, then you're essentially back to the scientific paradigm. What do you think scientists are trying to do? I mean, nobody's arguing that consciousness is a magic property of some sort. That it's
right.
that
all you're doing then is trying to show us what the building blocks of consciousness are, and presumably there'll be an evolutionary story. There'll be rudimentary forms,
right? So on and so forth.
But the way they describe it, it's almost like ancient atomism, like a piece of pizza is made out of tiny triangles, right? I mean, it's almost like that. It's almost like that, right? I mean, that's what the old Lockean sort of atoms were, right? I mean, there was like rectangles were made of little rectangles. I mean, it beggars belief, and if that's not what it is, then I don't see how it's any different from just what scientists do, which is to try to provide both a genealogical account as well as a kind of atomistic / reductive account, right? And then now, what do I need you for, right? I mean,
yes, exactly. What are you telling me exactly that it's new? Now, I pushed also Philip in a different direction. So there is a physicist who I respect a lot, theoretical physicist, Sabine Assenfelder, who actually wrote a really nice blog post on panpsychism and basically gave a rundown of the reasons why, from a physicist's perspective, there is no such a thing as consciousness as elemental property. And she went through, some of the properties we actually know fundamental matter has. And she said, look, if it turns out that we miss a property of some sort, then this would have empirical consequences. Then this would mean that our models of reality are significantly incomplete. And this would have to have empirical consequences. And she works out the details of this. Okay, so I presented that to Philip, and he said, oh, no. But see, here's the thing. She completely misunderstands panpsychism, because panpsychism is actually not about physical properties as we understand them. In other words, as they can be studied by physics. And I said, well, if it's not about physical properties as they can be understood by physics, what is it about exactly? Because then you risk falling in another kind of dualism. Yeah, it's another kind of dualism. And it's like, I don't think he had a particularly articulate answer to that question. You can't have it both ways, right? You can't say, oh, it's an elemental property of matter.
But it's not material.
Okay, well, it's not material. But it's just like, wait, what?
Right. And I actually pushed him on this in the Twitter. I wasn't in the letters exchange, but I did argue with him for a while on Twitter, and eventually I just got frustrated because I thought he was either just being unresponsive or obtuse. But I sort of asked him. I said, look, if these are elementary properties of material things, but it's not material, then why don't you have all the same interaction problems that any property dualist has, right? I mean, and,
right.
And I even pointed out to him. I said, look, my old mentor and teacher Jerry Katz wrote a whole book alleging that there are such things as he calls composite objects that have both concrete and abstract components. For example, he would say the equator is a composite object because it's both a location on the earth, but it's also a geometric circle. whatever you might think of that. But Katz at least understood that he owed some account of how it could be that abstract and material properties could interact in this way. And he wrote a whole book trying to outline what that account would have to look like. And I actually published a paper on it back in the day saying why I didn't think this would work. But the panpsychists don't even think that they owe any such account, right?
No, that's right. And the interesting thing,
it seems very stipulative. It seems like a very stipulative.
Yes. It's highly stipulative, but one of the frustrating things is that Goff's book is actually has a subtitle along the lines of, toward a new science. Well, no. If you're telling me that your alleged new science does not actually make any contact whatsoever with the empirical, and this is not, by the way, there are situations in science.
It's not driven by mathematics. It's not driven by mathematics.
It's not driven by mathematics, right?
Yeah.
But also, there are situations in science where a theory does not currently make contact with the empirical. The most obvious example is string theory, right? And sure enough, it's controversial. The same above-mentioned Sabine Ossenfelder has been in the fray with other physicists because she's arguing that essentially, for all effective purposes, string theory is mathematically informed metaphysics and not actual science. But at least with string theory, there is no objection in principle to the notion of empirical evidence. It's just that the energy levels that would be necessary in a particle accelerator to create situations that are amenable to testing string theory are so damn high that they are for all effective purposes impossible to achieve, not only now, but probably in the very distant future. But that's not an in-principle objection. It's a practical objection. The panpsychists, on the other hand, are saying that in principle, there is no connection with the empirical world. And if that's the case, then we're definitely not talking science.
Yeah. I don't want to attribute sort of, be conspiratorial or anything or attribute. No, well, I guess what I'm wondering is, because we've talked about this on a number of occasions, it's come up. Do you think that in general, we've become kind of loose and slovenly about science in the sense of what it is? In other words, do you think that there's some part of the reason that this is gaining traction now is because physicists themselves, at least some of them, have started playing games with the question of empirical confirmation? And
yeah, I think you're right. I mean, that's why people like Ossenfelder and my friend Jim Baggott, for instance, in the UK, who has also written a number of things. He's a physicist, written a number of things about these issues. That's why they're pushing back against notions like string theory, the multiverse, and things like that. And precisely on the ground, it's just not good science. They may or may not be true, but it's not good science.
Right.
Because if there is no way even in the distant future in the case of string theory, and even in principle in the case of, even worse, in the case of the multiverse, then what are we talking about? We're really, in a sense, going back to first philosophy.
Yeah, we're doing metaphysics.
Which is kind of ironic because these are the same scientists who usually, poo-poo the philosophy part and said, oh, that's absolutely not what I'm doing. As it turns out, you are. And yes, the problem that people are concerned with, some scientists are concerned with, is precisely that you're undermining the integrity of science by doing that. And you're,
Is this an active fight in the physics community? I mean, I guess are there scientists, let's call them conservatives, okay, who are saying no, we cannot have radicalism in science, like in this way, right? I mean, it's going to undermine not just its credibility, but it's going to, in a sense, change the landscape. It's going to allow for people to go in directions that are all going to wind up being dead ends, right? They're going or just spinning fancy yarns, so to speak. There's actually a fight going on?
Yes, there is. In fact, I was at a conference in Munich a few years ago on string theory, and when I was invited, I replied to the organizer and I said, "You got the wrong guy. I am not a philosopher of physics or a physicist." And the guy said, "Well, no, we know exactly who you are, and what we'd like to do is we know you're interested in the demarcation problem, so between science and pseudoscience and stuff like that, and you've written about Popper, who studied out this whole thing. And I said, well, okay, but what does that have to do with string theory? And the response was, well, the problem is that it seems to me that there's a bunch of physicists who are throwing Popper at each other without actually having read anything more than a Wikipedia article on Popper.
Yeah.
And so they're saying, this is falsifiable, this is not falsifiable. So would you mind coming in and sort of giving an opening lecture to just give us the Popper 101, and then maybe even bring us up to speed on what philosophy of science in general is right now, because, Popper is several decades old. Yeah. And so I accepted, and this was great. That's when I met Sabine and other people. There were a couple of Nobel Prizes there. And it was a great conference because I saw people really arguing for the entire 3 days on the nature of science. They were not actually arguing about physics. They were arguing about the nature of science. And the most recent book by Osenfeld that just came out last year. This year, there's a book by Sean Carroll on the other side of the divide, who really pushes hard for the multiverse interpretation, multiverse theory. So, yeah, it's very much going on. There have been front-page editorials, full-page editorials in Nature magazine about, let's take back the soul of physics. So, yeah, it's very much going on. And I think that people like Goff are latching onto this thing, whether consciously or not, I have no idea, of course. But they're sensing that there is turmoil in science, and then there is an opening for reinterpreting what science is. I mean, to be fair, Philip is not the first one, right? A few years ago, it was Thomas Nagel who wrote that book about the cosmos and stuff like that, which got really seriously criticized both by scientists and by philosophers of science, particularly, Elliot Sober, for instance, who wrote a really interesting review of that book. And that was the same general idea. I mean, after all, Nagel is the one that started out this whole thing about third-person experience with his famous classic paper on what is it like to be a bat.
He also wrote one of the early papers on panpsychism.
Yes, exactly.
And also on brain bisection and all sorts of interesting things that this is the last thing on this. Is there a generational aspect to this? Does it tend to be the older scientists tend to be more hard-nosed and conservative, and it's the younger ones who are going off on these wild, or do you not, or is it not general?
No, that's not my impression. In fact, if anything, up the other way around. There are some new physicists who are sick and tired of string theory because it's been around since the 80s and it hasn't led anywhere. And so they're kind of saying, hey, it's time to look somewhere else. It's time to do something else because this seems to be a dead end. Now, however, I want to ask you, we bring up a particular subtopic which you mentioned a minute ago, and they're kind of, and I would like to hear your opinion about this. So when I pushed Philip Goff about the empirical evidence stuff, right, and the fact that if you deny that there is any empirical evidence, then you're doing first philosophy. So you're just sitting down and assuming that by thinking about the world, you actually can discover things about the world, right? His response was, well, just the very asking of empirical evidence assumes a physicalist view, physicalist metaphysics, and we all know that physicalism is in trouble. Therefore, it's like, hold on a second. First of all, no, we don't all know that physicalism is in trouble, etc. I think that's a little too fast. But let's not have a discussion about physicalism. I grant you that physicalism is, of course, a metaphysical position. I might even grant you that physicalism is the unstated assumption that most of us, certainly in day-to-day life, and scientists kind of take on board and say, okay, if the world is made of matter, here's how I'm going to act in the world. Fine. Now, if it is a metaphysical position, then it's no better or worse than any other metaphysical position in terms of, you can come up with arguments pro and con, but you certainly cannot come up with empirical evidence pro and con.
Empirically, they're going to be neutral empirically.
Correct.
The advantage they have is going to be in terms of arguments and internal coherence and things like that. Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
So now there's a difference, however, here in terms of pragmatism, of usefulness. So if I assume, let's contrast, just to get my point across, hopefully a little bit better. Let's contrast two metaphysical views of how the world works. One is standard physicalist, the world is made of matter, where by matter, by the way, I mean whatever the physicists think it's at the bottom of stuff, okay, of things. Yeah. Whether it is muons, strings, fields, whatever the hell it is,
right?
Whatever they say. Okay, that's what I mean by physicalism or materialism. I don't mean matter as in this is a solid thing. So that's what I mean by physicalism. Let's contrast it with, let's say, something like a simulation hypothesis, where in fact the universe it's a computer simulation, and there's somebody who's actually set the parameters in place. There's nothing physical; it's all informational. We're literally inside like a video game kind of stuff, right? Great. Now, the empirical evidence is compatible with both metaphysical positions equally. There is by definition of a metaphysical position. And however, it turns out that if I build science and everyday activity on the assumption that actually things are made of matter, I operate pretty damn well. I don't see anything particularly practical coming out, or practically different coming out of the assumption that we live in a simulation. If I actually am convinced, if I say, okay, let me restructure science, right, on the basis not of physicalism, but of the simulation hypothesis, what would that look like? It would look to me exactly the same. You would still look for evidence,
I agree
right?
with that. Yeah.
It would still make sense to ask for epistemic warrant of your statements, and that epistemic warrant is guaranteed only by a combination of good arguments and evidence, and empirical evidence. Of course, empirical, if we actually live in a simulation, wouldn't mean the same thing that it means within a physicalist framework. Yeah. But for all effective purposes, you can't tell the two apart. So I'm going to reject Goff's suggestion that just by merely asking for evidence, I'm biasing things in the direction of physicalism. I don't think so.
Well, and it's a very odd, given the history of the history of 20th century philosophy, it's a very odd position to take, given that by far the most hard-nosed, scientifically minded verificationists were all phenomenalists. The logical positivists were phenomenalists.
That's
People
right.
forget this, right?
That's right.
But they actually didn't think, because they were such hard-nosed empiricists, they would not make any judgments beyond experience, right? And
That's
so
right.
Carnap wrote a whole book, The Logical Construction of the World, right?
Yep.
So I mean, and these people were members of the Vienna Circle. There was a bunch of physicists amongst them. So it can't be the case that to be empirically minded presupposes materialism, because as a matter of fact, the most empirically minded people in the 20th century were not physicalists. They were phenomenalists.
Exactly.
Now he might say, well, they were all holding a view that you can't hold, but I don't see why. And like you said, I mean, look, it was very rhetorically effective, but this was, of course, the stupidity of Samuel Johnson's response to Berkeley, right? Kicking a stone. That doesn't prove anything, right?
No, that's right. It doesn't. Exactly. Well, I'm glad you bring that one up. So that's another contrast, right? A physicalist view versus an idealist view.
Yeah.
Well, sure. But if idealism means that the world is still going to look and behave, more importantly, exactly as a physicalist will tell you, then what are we talking about?
Right.
We can kick the stone, and it makes no difference, and in terms of your metaphysical position, and that should tell you that therefore the empirical evidence isn't, asking for empirical evidence isn't biasing you toward a particular metaphysical view.
That's right.
Now, the problem that I have with metaphysical views in general, as much as it is fun to talk about physicalism and idealism and all sorts of isms that you want, the problem is this: precisely because the empirical evidence cannot discriminate among these views, right? That what you have there is a bunch of logically coherent scenarios. Right? More or less logically coherent, because there are certain metaphysical positions that actually might not even be logically coherent. But let's take the best ones, the ones that actually are logically coherent, right? Well, the problem with that is the general problem of the mapping between logic and the world. There is, as far as we know, save for Shankar's multiverse, as far as we know, there is one physical world. That is what science is interested in. That's what we tend to be mostly interested in.
Yeah.
In terms of logical worlds, there is an infinite number of them.
That's right.
Right? Because the only criteria there to restrict your logical analysis of the world is internal coherence.
That's right.
But there is an infinite number of internally coherent logical possibilities, just like there is an infinite number of internally coherent mathematical structures.
That's right.
Right? That's my understanding, for instance, of why mathematics works so well and surprisingly well to describe aspects of the natural world, right? And yet the overwhelming majority of mathematics doesn't seem to have anything to do with the natural world. Why is that? Well, because if mathematics represents all conceivable, right, logically coherent, mathematically internally coherent structures, and the physical world is one such structure, it's an implementation of such one structure.
Onto it.
Then, right.
But most are not, which is exactly what you would expect, and is exactly what winds up being the case, right?
Correct. And I think that metaphysics, metaphysics as a sort of a prime first philosophy is in the same boat there. That there's probably going to be, I don't know about an infinite, but certainly a very large number of internally coherent metaphysical scenarios. But because they're all equal in terms of, or equivalent in terms of the empirical structure of the world, then frankly, I'm not that interested.
Yeah.
You can.
There's a
what are you going to do with that?
Difference, though, don't you think? I mean, look between, and this is maybe getting us way off, but it's interesting. Between, on the one hand, logic and mathematics, and on the other hand, metaphysics, right? And so the fact, though, is that despite the fact that the overwhelming majority of mathematical systems have no relevance to the actual world at all, the fact that some do is what you would expect given the nature of mathematical systems and the fact that there's one world.
Right.
But nonetheless, the mathematical and logical systems are useful instruments, right, for the empirical understanding. In other words, they do have a practical utility, right?
Yeah.
In science, right?
Yes.
Metaphysics, it seems to me, only has a practical utility within the manifest image, right? In other words,
right.
What metaphysics does is provide intelligible narratives,
yes,
to us as people, right?
Yes.
About the material. In other words, science does not really provide us with any sort of intelligible narrative, which is why we always interpret it in terms of the concepts and ideas of the manifest. It seems to me that to the extent to which metaphysics has a value, it operates entirely within the manifest image. Whereas it seems that mathematics and logic have a direct relevance, practical relevance to the scientific image.
Absolutely. And in fact, I'm glad you mentioned that because we should remind our listeners that there actually are now two modes, two views about how to do metaphysics. One is the one that we've been talking about so far. Let's call it first philosophy type of metaphysics, right? This is the approach that of people that think that you can just sit down, think about stuff like mathematicians do or logicians do, and come up with new discoveries about the world, new statements about the world, right? That, as I think I made perfectly clear so far, I think it's dead in the water and has been dead since Descartes. So it's time to sort of bury it, give it a nice funeral, acknowledge all of the stuff that it has done up to Descartes, and then move on. But there is a second approach, which is right now, my understanding is a humanitarian approach within the field. That's what's sometimes referred to as scientific metaphysics. And this is the stuff that people like James Lediman and Don Ross and collaborators have been doing for a while. Arguably one of the best books about that. There's a collection actually called Scientific Metaphysics, edited by Lediman and Ross. But arguably the best implementation of it that I know of so far has been a book called Everything Must Go. Everything meaning two words, right? And that it's about what kind of metaphysical picture comes out of the natural sciences, and particularly from fundamental physics. And what Lediman and Ross and collaborators are saying is that the project of metaphysics should be not to discover new things, because we got science for that, but to step back from science and just sort of put together a coherent overall picture that comes out of the individual specialized pictures of the special sciences, including physics, but not only, biology, etc. Bridging the gaps, for instance, bridging gaps between sciences, and so on and so forth. Which I think you're right, it squarely belongs to the manifest image. It's not something that is helping the scientist doing anything. And that's why I still do have interest in metaphysics, in the sense of
I'm still interested in, realism, anti-realism debates and all that sort of stuff,
Sure.
because I do, as you know from our discussions on the subject, I don't view the manifest image as dispensable or as
right.
insignificant. Indeed, I think it's the ultimate. It's the end game. It seems to me, because we are people. I agree. And this is your constant refrain that science is a human activity.
Right.
So I entirely concur with that. Let's switch over to the let's talk about the illusionism a little bit.
Sure. The other side of the debate.
Yeah, because it's here that I start to think I do have a suspicion of what the problem is and why we're not able to solve it. I have a suspicion about it that the illusionism really makes clear. So at least the Frankish view of the illusionism is that, and whether it's identical to Dennett's or whether it just borrows heavily from it, I don't really care. But what Frankish essentially says is that, look, the problem of consciousness is the problem of thinking that consciousness is a problem because there's a special property called qualia or quality, right?
Right.
But there's really no... So illusionism is not that there's no consciousness. Illusionism is the view that consciousness is not of a certain kind of property, right? Of a certain kind of thing, i.e. qualia.
Yes.
And it's only if you think of consciousness as the experience of a special kind of thing that it creates a problem, because qualia are weird kinds of things, right? But once you realize that, no, there's just brain processes that, from what I gathered from Frankish, he's kind of an in-between a physicalist and a functionalist, right? I mean, there are certain things that I think he thinks can be reduced all the way down to sort of the biochemical properties. And then there's other things that are only going to be reducible to the architectural properties, right?
Yes.
Right. That's the sense I get from the article, is that he's kind of a mixed guy there. And so the illusionism comes in only with regard to the thinking that there's a special property. It's not that we aren't conscious of things. It's that we're conscious of things. We're not conscious of mental qualities, right? And once you realize that, the problem sort of dissolves. Now, I don't think that the problem dissolves, but I do think that this illustrates that maybe the problem isn't what people... In other words, I think that he's right to focus on the problem-making aspects of qualia.
Yeah.
But I don't. But ultimately, I think that there remains a problem. Once you sort of get rid of the qualia, there still remains a problem, and then maybe it's clearer what the problem is. How do you just feel in general about this thing about illusionism, not rejecting consciousness, but rejecting the idea that consciousness is of a special kind of mental object?
So that's an interesting way to put it. And actually, I'm going to ask you a question in a second to just clarify my own thinking and further discussion. But when you say that illusionists don't think that consciousness is an illusion, well, then it certainly has been on record as saying that consciousness is an illusion. But then he qualifies it in certain ways. And so I think that your reconstruction of what their position is, I think it's correct. I think sometimes these people are a little either sloppy with their language, which is kind of surprising from Dennett, for people like Dennett, or provocative, which is actually more in line with Dennett as I know him. So because if you go on and say, "Hey, consciousness is an illusion," people are going to say, "Well, what do you mean by that?" And then they're going to start paying attention. But I do think that what they mean is something closer to what you were saying. But then the question becomes, so one way I've heard the illusionist position presented is it's not that people don't have first-person experiences, it's that qualia don't exist. But from the outside, it often looks like qualia is simply a technical term for first-person experience. So unless we draw some kind of intelligible distinction there, I'm not sure what we're saying. Yeah, or what they are saying. Yeah, I suppose.
Yeah, and I think that this also, there was some time ago I was got in the habit of telling people to stop ever using the words subjective and objective, because they misuse it. I think that part of what the problem that happened was that subjectives and objectives started being used not just to describe epistemic positions, but to actually describe things, right? So qualia were now called subjective properties, right? In the metaphysical sense, right? Not in the sense that they're only properties you know of from a certain perspective, but they're somehow inherently subjective, right? And thus they're mental, right? Right. This goes all the way back to Locke and to this whole primary secondary quality distinction, right? And so what Goff is trying to say is that the appearance of a hard problem arises because we take conscious experience to be experience of distinctly subjective mental properties. And how could there be such things in a physical universe, right?
Right, of course, right.
And so I don't even know if I think historically he's necessarily wrong about where the hard problem comes from. But if you remember the way that you are described Chalmers' characterization of the hard problem, it arises entirely out of the perspectival shift. It does not arise because of some inherent property of the object of consciousness, right?
Absolutely.
It arises because of the perspective of consciousness, right?
Right.
In other words, how do we make sense of first-person perspectives in the language of a third-person science is what I always understood the problem to be in myself. Yeah. It was the only problem that made sense to me. I never understood the...
So that's why I suggested, no, I think you're right. That's why I suggested in the past that actually the way Chalmers and I think also Goff at this point puts the problem is it's a category mistake. Because what they're trying to do, sometimes at least it sounds like, what they're trying to do is they're trying to blame science for doing its job right, in a sense. I mean, we all know the distinctions between, knowledge of and knowledge that and things like that in epistemology. That's not a controversial distinction. So it shouldn't be controversial to say that what science is in the business of doing is to come up with a mechanistic story, empirically based, experimentally based, mechanistic story about what makes possible, how is it possible that you see red, okay? And that story will look something like this. Look, there are certain cells that are receptive, they're capable because of their pigments to, receive information from the environment. They translate that information in the optical nerve interprets that information, et cetera, and you see red. But none of that, of course, has anything to do with your first-person experience of, hey, I'm seeing red.
Right.
But that's not because there is anything missing from the scientific story.
Right.
It's just a completely different kind of question. So it does remind me of the classic example of a category mistake, which is the person who is told that is brought around Oxford University and shown the building, the faculty, the student, the administration.
Where's the university?
And then where's the university? It's like, well, what do you mean? I showed you that's all in terms of empirical stuff. That is it. Now, if you're talking about the university as a concept, then I can't show you the concept. This is something completely different.
Right. The university is not an additional object. And I do think that the consciousness problem does partly involve a mistaken kind of hypostatization, right? But I'm wondering whether it's even more than that in the sense that, look, here's what Goff. So I went through the Goff piece and I copied and pasted the relevant parts, and as I said to you, as I characterized him before when I described to you, I said, look, Goff doesn't deny that there's consciousness. What he wants to deny is that consciousness is of some special mental quality, i.e. qualia, or properties, or whatever you want to call them. And he wants to say, no, consciousness is just ordinary experience, right? And we have a physical / functional account of how ordinary experience works, right? And he gives these sort of, so here's just a line, okay? When we look at a ripe banana, complex representational and reactive processes occur in our brains. Our introspective systems monitor these processes, but misrepresent them as a simple quality, the pure feel of yellowness, right? So the idea is that, look, we have all these experiences of things, right? That involves a sort of a direction of attention. So I have an experience of the bag over there. I have an experience of my coffee cup over here. These are all, I've directed my attention to different things, and I get various experiences. However, I can also turn my attention to my experiences, right?
Yeah.
And the way that that's presented, though, is simplified, right? I don't perceive all the intricate procedures. What I perceive is a sort of a simplification, yellowness, right? Or
right.
Now, this is all very nice, but notice something, and I pay very close attention to language. Notice this part of the statement: our introspective systems monitor these processes, but misrepresent them.
Right.
Okay, systems don't monitor anything; people monitor things.
Correct.
Now,
that's right.
Right. So what all of this is a gigantic exercise in begging the question, right?
Yes,
if the problem is, as Chalmers originally, your characterization of Chalmers, which I think is actually a really good characterization, the problem then really, you realize that the problem is not a problem about qualia or about experience. It's really a problem about persons and personhood, right?
Yes.
And so what I'm wondering is, are we really going to wind up having two accounts that are entirely in separate domains? And the mistake is in thinking that we're going to have a unified account. We're going to have a very sophisticated scientific account,
right,
of what the brain processes are that are involved in consciousness. However, we are always going to still have the problem of perspective, right?
Yes.
But that's not a scientific problem. That's a problem about how... In other words, that's a problem that's over in the manifest image, right?
Correct. It's a problem how we talk about it.
Solvable.
Right.
And that way, it's like the realism, anti-realism argument, right? I don't think it ultimately is going to have any efficacy in the scientific side, but it will have an enormous significance in the narrative that we tell, right?
Yeah.
I
like that.
I'm starting to suspect the problem is.
Mm-hmm.
And why people
I like that
like they're banging on it, right?
I like that way to put it. Yes, that's right. The hard problem of consciousness, or whatever it is, I think it's squarely in the manifest image, and so it's a question of language. It's a question of how we talk about stuff. It may have sort of a high level scientific input from there, like the field rather than field there is psychology, not neurobiology, not neuroscience, or not chemistry or anything like that. It's because psychology is a field that it's bridging, in my mind at least, bridges the humanities.
It's got to be at a higher level of description than those really...
Correct. And psychology, because I say psychology because psychology, of course, is in a sense a science. I mean, it is informed by empirical evidence, but it's also very much about the manifest image. And therefore, the language of it is much more approachable, much more usable in terms of the manifest image. But there's another thing that I wanted to point out your attention to. When in the very passage you just read, the word mischaracterization, right? So can you reread that bit?
Yeah. When we look at a ripe banana, complex representational and reactive processes occur in our brains. Our introspective systems monitor these processes, but misrepresent them as a simple quality, the pure feel of yellowness.
Right. So there, ironically, I think, Goff has something in common with the illusionists, because the famous illusionist metaphor proposed by Dennett is that the way in which our mental processes work like the icons on a computer, right, on a desktop computer, and so that there is really no file, on your computer in the sense that you think of a physical object. It's just a representation. It's an icon. It's a representation of a process.
Yeah.
Right now, here's when in the article that I wrote, the rebuttal article that I wrote about illusionism, I say, yeah, sure, fine, I like that analogy, but these are not misrepresentations; these are useful representations. Okay, so what's going on here? Let me give you an analogy. So, one of my hobbies is to keep track of space exploration stuff, because when I was a kid, I wanted to become an astronomer, and so now one of the things that you get that you understand pretty quickly is that when you see photos that are from deep space, so we send a probe to Jupiter, let's say, or to Neptune, and you see the beautiful pictures in color and all that sort of stuff. There is no photo. These are not photos. Okay, this is a computer that scans the environment with an incredibly complex array of instruments. And what we look at on the other side of the terminal as a photo is actually a representation, a simplified representation of a bunch of information that computer has gathered by using a lot of tools. But it's not a misleading or mischaracterizing anything. It's just a representation that translates a lot of technical detailed information that the human brain would not be able to process into something that the human brain can process. In a sense, it's kind of NASA's equivalent of bridging the divide between the scientific and the manifest image, right? The NASA technicians and scientists have to be looking at something simply because human beings look at stuff. We understand the world by looking at stuff.
That's right.
If you feed me the raw feed from the computer, it's gibberish.
Yeah.
Okay. Now, very similarly, I think this is exactly what the human brain does with the environment. Okay, so our brains are actually processing a huge amount of information that comes from literally millions of cells. Okay, individual cells in your eyes, in your ears, in your throughout your body. All of this stuff that creates sensations and gets input from the outside. It's millions, billions of things that are processed inside a brain that is made of literally trillions of connections. Okay, now if you had actually access to the machine code, so to speak, right? You wouldn't understand a damn thing of what's going on. Just like if I I'm using a tablet now to talk to you. If I actually, instead of seeing you on the screen and this nice little icon that says, mute, stop video and all that sort of stuff, if I actually needed access to the machine code to mute myself or to stop the video or something like that, first of all, I wouldn't be able to do it. And second of all, it would take me days to process this kind of stuff, right? Instead, there's this nice little convenient thing that says mute. I click it, and everything goes on. Is that misleading? No, it isn't. It's misleading only if you begin to think of the file icon or the mute icon as actual objects. That is misleading.
That's
Absolutely.
right.
And that's, I think, what you were saying earlier. That's profoundly misleading because they're not objects. They are high-level representations, understandable to the human mind, of complex underlying processes.
Yeah.
That, I think, is precisely what consciousness is and what first-person experiences are. They are high-level representations that are useful for us to navigate the world of very complicated underlying processes and information. That's it. But there's nothing misleading about it. It's actually useful. This is the result of evolution. That's why I mentioned to Philip that I would expect any kind of serious advancement in our understanding of consciousness to come out from a combination of neuroscience and evolutionary biology. Why evolutionary biology? Because we forget that this stuff evolved.
Yeah.
We forget that sensorial systems and ways to analyze and represent sensorial systems, in other words, brains, are very different in the biological world. Different animals do it in radically different ways. I mean, I cannot imagine what it is like to be an octopus, not because it's somehow mystical or anything like that, but because octopi have a different kind of brain, especially have different kinds of sensorial organs.
Yeah.
That's or bat, if you want to go back to Nagel's analogy, right?
Yeah.
The reason we cannot understand what it is like to be a bat is simply because the bat has a brain system that creates different kinds of icons, if you will, to the bat, because the bat sensorial system works differently from the human brain. If you just implanted, the bat system into a human brain, you get gibberish.
Yeah.
In the same way in which if I all of a sudden start using the exact same code that is on my iPad on something that is actually not an iOS-based system, I don't get anything.
Yeah.
The whole thing disappears. So one of the things that I objected about this to the illusionist perspective is this notion that we don't have access to our mental processes. We have only access to misleading representations. Yeah. That's right. We don't have access to our inner processes, and we don't want access to the inner processes. That would be overwhelming. You would do nothing with that access. But the icons that we use are the result of evolution. They're fine-tuned for helping us navigate the world, so they're not misleading. They're just
the misleading. That's the thing. Look. I mean, even Frankish, and I don't know if Dennis talks, but Frankish does say that this illusion or misrepresentation is functionally useful, right? I mean, for exactly the reason that you say. But by characterizing it as a misrepresentation, you actually create a false impression of what the relation and the relata are, right?
That's right.
And part of the issue that I think comes up here is that I almost think that in the consciousness problem, you have a problem that crosses over from science into philosophy, right? And in other words, you said that we're going to need at least psychology, evolutionary biology, and psychology, which would include
the science.
Yeah. But I'm going to say there's a third part of the stool, a third leg of the stool, and that's an account of personhood, right? And that's going to come first. Why? Because no matter what you do, the perspectival version of the problem persists, right?
Yes.
Because what you constantly get to this point is of, okay, who is experiencing the illusion? Who is monitoring the processes? And then you wind up, well, the person is, right? But now you're no longer in the scientific image. Now you're in the manifest image.
Correct.
In other words, I almost think that the problem of consciousness is a problem that straddles evolutionary biology, psychology, including its physical, neuropsychology and all that stuff, but then also philosophy of language. Yes, absolutely. And I mentioned earlier, this is a problem of language. That's entirely in the manifest image. I think that partly the problem of consciousness is a problem that arises out of perspectival language.
Yes, I agree. That's why I mentioned earlier. This is in part a problem of how we talk about stuff.
Yeah,
and that's why I object to certain ways of talking about stuff. Right, but as far as the illusionists are concerned, one of the reasons I sort of push back about that thing, I think that, as I said, I think that Dennett's analogy is actually useful, particularly when you go on and say these icons have actually functional utility, right? But the reason I push back against that way of talking is because then we are told that we cannot rely on our own understanding of our mental states and so on and so forth. It's like, well, yes, I can, in the way in which I rely on icons on my desktop. Again, if I mislead myself into thinking that those icons are actually objects, right? Then of course this is incorrect. But if I understand what they are, and I say, okay, these are proxies. These are just in order to simplify my life. They're really proxies for complex underlying processes. Then it's fine. There is no misleading, so long as, and that's what I argue in my response to the illusionist stuff. So long as there is a reliable causal connection between the icon, the representation, right, and the underlying process. And guess what guarantees that there is a reliable underlying connection under normal operating conditions? Evolution.
Yeah.
Because the evolution is the thing that guarantees. For instance, let me give you a very personal example. So I'm partially colorblind, right? And I probably would have been dead in the Pleistocene, because there are certain shades of green and red that I don't see. I don't discriminate, right? Especially, for instance, red over black background. I just can't see it. Now, today this is not a problem, of course, and I navigate the world fine. But the reason that Daltonism and the inability to see colors, etc., has a low frequency in the population is precisely because in the past, at least, this was a matter of life, literally a matter of life and death. Now, does that mean that when people see red or blue or whatever it is, they're somehow being misled by their icons on the desktop that they don't have? No, they're not. Of course, there is no such thing as red out there. What's out there is electromagnetic waves.
Yeah.
And we cannot perceive electromagnetic waves directly. We represent them. Our system, our sensorial system, does have a way to perceive the electromagnetic waves, and it represents them in a certain fashion, color red. Now, how do we know this? Interestingly, that's not only because there are people who are affected, and they cannot see red, but because you can actually now go there. We know enough about the physiology underlying visions that you can actually go there and play with the system, right? Change things around, so you actually cause misperception of colors. And now the person is really not. Now there is no longer a reliable correspondence between the icon and the underlying process. But that's because, in fact, the system is not working correctly. Yeah. It's not working as evolution intended it to work. That's why I keep saying that it's wrong to talk about misleading information. It's not misleading.
No,
it's functional.
It's and they say it's functional by way of being misleading, right?
Yeah, right.
Yes. Because if it wasn't misleading, it would be you couldn't cope with it, right? And so, it's not, the reason why misleading is inapt is because that implies a relationship of sort of almost like a failed mimesis or something, right? Which is not what's going on at all. No. It seems to me more like it's more relevantly at the level of understood in the frame of levels of description, right? And the so-called, and I'm scare quoting it, emergent characteristics that arise out of higher levels of description, right? Look, I mean, part of the thing I was trying to get at in terms of just talking about the language side of it is that the problem of consciousness doesn't arise for creatures that are conscious but are non-linguistic or non-conceptual, right? In the sense that it arises because we are able to adopt different perspectives, right? And, one of the reasons why I think part of the reason why this problem doesn't puzzle me as much as some philosophers is I actually came to philosophy from literature. And one of the great things in literature is the playing with perspective. Sometimes within the same novel. So, for example, William Faulkner has a brilliant novel called As I Lay Dying, where each chapter is the same sequence of events from a different character's point of view. Yes. And one character is like a retarded child. The other character is an old person. The other, and what's, you could create a problem out of those multiple perspectives. How can the same event have all these properties? And the answer is there's no mystery about it. There's no mystery. The reason they have all these different properties is because they're being described from different points of view.
Correct. Exactly. And with different levels of description.
I feel like the consciousness problem is a problem like that. And that's why I'm tempted to say it's a non-problem. Right? It's a combination of elements that when you put them all together and look at them naively, seems incredibly problematic, but once you sort of pull them apart and say, oh, wait a minute, there's not going to be a unified account of consciousness. The scientists are going to tell us how the brain works, right? That's right. The people over who are novel writers and philosophers are going to talk about how adopting different perspectives works.
Exactly.
But they're not going to be exactly.
No, and that's right. That's it.
Kind of multiple stories.
That's right.
But
and that, again,
people want there to be one, right?
Yeah, exactly. And so it turns out again that Seller's view of this, the stereoscopic view comes back into play, right? So he never said that. In fact, he explicitly said that you shouldn't try to reduce one view to the other. And so what scientists who ignore the philosophy aspect of it are trying to do is to reduce the problem of consciousness only to the scientific aspect. What people like, I think, Goff and Chalmers are trying to do is actually to reduce it only to the manifest image, while in fact you need to keep an eye on both. Yeah. Because they're telling you information, they're giving you a perspective that need to be integrated so you get the full picture. But the full picture does come out of a number of sub-pictures. Right. That don't necessarily relate directly to each other. And so if you try to relate them to each other directly and say, okay, I want to use the same language to encompass the whole thing, then that definitely is a mistake.
They want to say that there's a single picture that is, in a sense, a collage. Yes. Whereas the correct thing is there's a single picture, but there's only a single picture in the sense that if you look through multiple screens at once, you get a single impression, right? Yes. But there's not a single picture, right?
That's right.
Because there's not a single thing you're talking about. You're talking about a bunch of different things.
Yep. Exactly. I completely agree.
And that's why I was suspecting that the panpsychist and the illusionist actually have the same mistake. They mistake the subject as being about a single thing with a single solution when the subject really is multiple things with local solutions that when you look at them all together give you a picture. But that's simply the result of looking through the multiple transparencies and seeing the single.
Exactly. I agree. So look at that. In a little bit more than an hour and 15 minutes, we solved the problem of consciousness.
All right. Well, we will write this up and our futures will be assured as going down as the quines of the 21st century.
That's right.
Thank you so much. this was a wonderful distraction. I won't lie, Massimo, and I'm sure you feel this. I'm very worried about you and about my family and being in the hot zone, and I pray that please take care of yourself. Fortunately, you know how. You know how to
we'll
not
do our best.
But
yes.
yeah, please be careful. And
yes. We'll do our best, and hopefully we'll do a lot more of these in the future. This was a lot of fun.
Yeah, I enjoyed it too. One last thing. I'm not heard from. How is our book doing?
Well, that's a good question. I haven't heard any additional sort of reports because the first official report, I think, is not even out because it's usually 6 months after publication.
But it already went into a second printing, am I correct?
Correct. So it went already into the second printing, which means it's doing pretty well. I mean, definitely better than they expected because they expected the first printing to last a year, and it only lasted a few weeks. So it's actually doing very well. But we'll get the first report, I think, after 6 months. So we'll see. And we're talking about how to live a good life,
of which we've already seen. And maybe you and I will talk about the book at some point. Since I know Bob had you and Sky on, but I thought maybe you and I would talk about it at some point too.
Yeah.
Anyway,
I'm sure there's more than one perspective. So
yeah, right. Good luck with online teaching, and
thank you.
Take care of yourself.
Same to you.
All right, ciao.